Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome to another video. I know it's been over a week since I've posted a video, but I've just been busy. Today's movie today I'm doing a ranking video on a movie franchise, which I haven't done one of these in a while. And now, yes, I am going to get back. I know I've been saying it, but I swear I'm going to get back to reviewing the Toy Story movies, but for now, just been super busy. But anyways, we're focusing on this video at the moment. Today's movie franchise I'm going to be ranking is all 6 Death Wish movies from the worst to the best. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Death Wish, it is a movie series that first began in 1974, where the original movie was an action thriller starring Charles Bronson seeking revenge on a group of robbers who basically, assault his wife and brutally beat his daughter, causing her years of psychological trauma. Well, and the movie was so popular that it spawned 4 sequels and, of course, a remake in 2018 starring Bruce Willis. And overall, I would say that this is definitely one of my favorite action movie franchises of all time, and one of the very few movie franchises that I don't think there's been a single bad movie in. And so, yeah, before I get into my ranking, tell me down below, how would you rank these movies? And what's your experience with Death Wish? Are you a fan of the original movie? Do you like any of the sequels? Or have you only seen the Death Wish remake? That'd be an interesting conversation. But without further ado, let's begin. Coming in at number 6 for me is going to be Death Wish 5, The Face of Death, released in 1994, starring Charles Bronson. Now, again, I do like this movie, but the reason it's ranked a little lower for me is I just enjoy the other movies more, and I do think that while this movie does have a good story going for it, I do think of all the movies, it does have the weakest story of all the movies. And even though he is still really good in the movie, you can tell that, Charles Bronson, you can tell that he's getting rather old to be playing this character, Paul Kersey, because he was like 72 when this came out, and there are some parts that, I do think are a little out there. Not that I don't mind unrealistic stuff, but, but at the end of the day, and the pacing in this, I do think is a little slower than some of the others, but I still do like this movie at the end of the day, and I would recommend it. In fact, the original Death Wish movie from 1974 is actually free on YouTube with ads, and the sequels to this movie are actually free on Tubi and Prime Video right now. But at the end of the day, I do think this is a good movie, and it was a good enough send-off to the original Death Wish franchise, and I'm going to give Death Wish 5, The Face of Death, a 7 out of 10. Coming in at number 5 for me is actually the most recent addition to the franchise, and that is Death Wish, the 2018 remake starring Bruce Willis. Now, this was my introduction to the series. As you know, at the time, I had no idea that this movie was a remake, but I eventually found out it was, and then watched the original movie and checked out the rest of the franchise. Now, I do think this is a good remake. This remake, it does take the story of the original movie, but it does something a little different with it, which I do appreciate when remakes do that. And I do think that Paul Kersey, played by Bruce Willis, while he's not on the caliber of Charles Bronson from the original movie, I still thought that he did play a pretty good version of Paul Kersey here. The only reason that this is not ranked higher for me is the CG. There are some parts with some pretty bad CGI, and I don't like how this movie ends, because yes, the good guy does win, but it kind of teases a sequel, but we never got one, so it just kind of feels like okay, it just kind of ends. But overall, I thought that this was a pretty good remake, and I would recommend it, and I'm going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. Coming in at number 4 for me is actually going to be the original movie, Death Wish from 1974 starring Charles Bronson. Now, I do really like... Oh, and another thing I forgot to mention with the Death Wish remake, one change I do like with the Death Wish remake is that, see, in the original movie, Paul Kersey was an architect. I liked how they made him a doctor in the remake. I thought that that was a rather interesting change. But anyways, going forward. So yeah, like I said, at number 4 is the original Death Wish. I do think this is a good movie. It was a good start to the franchise, but I just happen to prefer some sequels above it, which for reasons that I'll get to. But what I think works well about the original Death Wish movie is the story and the lead character, where basically the movie is about an architect by the name of Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, who his wife and his daughter are at home when Paul Kersey's at work, and a group of bad guys break into his home and brutally beat his daughter, knocking her out, and they basically are responsible for the death of Paul Kersey's wife. But Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, is very annoyed that the cops are not doing anything about it. So at nighttime, he decides to become a vigilante and take out the bad guys himself, which I do think that it is a rather good story. And I do like Charles Bronson as this main character, Paul Kersey. The only reason it's not ranked higher for me is I do think the movie is paced well, but I do wish there was a little more action to it. And I'm overall not a big fan of the way this movie ends. I think it's way too abrupt. But luckily, the sequel to this movie ended up tying... It basically ties up the loose ends of this movie. But yeah, rather good movie on the whole front. And I'm going to give the original Death Wish an 8 out of 10. Coming in at number 3 for me is going to be Death Wish 2 from 1982. Now, this is how you do a sequel right, where this movie takes everything that was great about the original movie and just does it a little better. I think that the action here, I like how this movie moves by at a faster pace. I think that the action scenes are really good. Once again, Charles Bronson gives a really good performance as Paul Kersey, and I do think of all the Death Wish movies, this does have, and just Charles Bronson in general, at least from the movies of his I've seen, I do think this does have the best one-liners of any of the Death Wish movies. For example, I really like the scene when Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, is talking to one of the bad guys, and he's pointing a gun at him, and he says, "Do you believe in God?" And the bad guy says, "Yes." And then I like the part when Paul Kersey says, "Well, you're about to meet him," just before he pulls the trigger. I'm like, that is such a cold line, but it's really well executed. And yeah, just great sequel. And what I like about this movie is how, remember how I said I didn't really like the ending of the first movie? Well, this movie completely fixes that, because the bad guy who escaped at the end of the first movie, actually, Paul Kersey manages to actually get revenge on him. And what I like about this sequel is how it takes place not too long after the first movie, where we basically learned that, you know, his daughter's alive, but, like, she's gone through years of treatment, you know, because she's trying to get over the trauma of what happened from the events of the first movie. But yeah, just great sequel on the whole front, and I'm going to give this movie a 9 out of 10. Coming in at number 2 for me is going to be Death Wish 4: The Crackdown, which with Zach D Productions, I know that this is actually his favorite movie of the franchise, and I can see why. It is a really good sequel, but it's not quite my favorite, which we have yet to get to what that is, but if you've paid attention, I'm sure you can guess by now what it is. But anyways, let's talk about Death Wish 4: The Crackdown. What I really like about this movie is the action scenes, and Michael Winner, who directed the Michael Winner, I think that's his name, who directed the first 3 movies, did not come back to direct this. This was directed by Lee J. Thompson. I think that's the name of the guy who directed this movie, but he did a great job taking over. In fact, he would actually work with Charles Bronson on a movie after this called Kinjite Forbidden Subjects, which is a movie that I rather enjoy. But what I really like about this movie is I think that the action scenes are fun. I think that this movie is very fast-paced, and I'm not going to spoil what it is for those who haven't seen this movie, but there is a very good twist later on in the movie that I did not see coming at all. But yeah, Death Wish 4 The Crackdown, great sequel, and I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. And it came out in 1987, which 1987 was one of the best years ever for movies, especially action movies. You know, you had Predator, you had Lethal Weapon, The Living Daylights. This movie just 1987 was not only a great year for action movies, but just movies in general. So yeah. And of course, my number one, Process of Elimination, is Death Wish 3 from 1985. I thought this movie took the best elements of the original and the second movie, but it just cranks it up to 11 and makes it even better. I absolutely love Death Wish 3. And the story to this movie is where Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, basically goes to New York, to basically visit his best friend, but a gang in New York went to his apartment and killed his friend. And Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, has one simple goal: take out all the bad guys who run the streets of New York and avenge the death of his friend. That right there, I think, is a simple plot. It's a plot you can get behind, and once again, I think this honestly, not only is this my favorite Death Wish movie, it's also my favorite Charles Bronson movie, but I think that this movie has by far the best action scenes in the entire franchise. I also really like the villains in this movie. One of the bad guys is actually played by Alex Winters, who, of course, was Bill's partner in, of course, the Keanu Reeves movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, but who was also in The Lost Boys, a great vampire movie. So I didn't expect to see him play a bad guy. That's very different from what he typically does as an actor. But yeah, Death Wish 3, the perfect Death Wish movie. And yeah, I guess really the only negative I have with it, and this is like a very small one, is I guess there's one character I like from the movie that I kind of wish would have returned in one of the sequels, but other than that, I don't have any real complaints with this, and I'm going to give this a 9.5 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my ranking of the Death Wish movies. Go ahead, share your list in the comment section down below, and next up, I will be reviewing Toy Story 5. Not Toy Story 5. That's not out yet. Toy Story 4. Ugh. Get back to those reviews, and then I'll eventually, review Lightyear. But we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.